If everyone will please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, this morning we're going to start off with presentations from the Bureau of Wildlife Management, whose committee is chaired by Commissioner Hoover, and it looks like Dr. Rosenberry is up first.
Any particular one that you want to start with? We'll start with statistics.
Exciting. Yeah. I like it.
So for the majority of people, statistics bring up negative thoughts and may not be trusted. Common statements may include you can make statistics say anything you want, or statistics are just guesses. And despite these negative views, statistics can be used to solve important problems in wildlife management. And often, statistics are our only option when dealing with the realities of wildlife management. Common questions in wildlife management include how many animals are in the population, and is the population increasing, decreasing, or stable? Unfortunately, counting wildlife is difficult. Wildlife are adapted to their environments, and one of these adaptations is to minimize behaviors that expose them to threats. As a result, they can be difficult to see. However, sometimes they appear to cooperate with our interest in counting them, such as in this photo. And despite this cooperation, it's still not easy to count them. A few years ago, we posted this photo on Facebook and asked how many elk are in the photo. The counts range from 24 to 31 elk. There are, in fact, at least 37 elk visible in the photograph. Even with a photograph, it was difficult to get an accurate count of the number of elk. And as biologists, we are especially aware of these challenges when counting wildlife, and that is one of the reasons that we rely on statistics in our work. Counting deer harvests is also just as difficult sometimes as counting the number of animals that are out there. In Pennsylvania, successful deer hunters are required to report their harvest within 10 days. If the hunter has a DMAP permit, they're required to report regardless of harvest by early February. Unfortunately, not all hunters follow these requirements. For the regular deer harvest reports, about a third of successful deer hunters report their harvest. And back in 2013, DMAP reporting rates were not much better. To try and avoid DMAP or prevent DMAP reporting rates from falling to the levels of regular harvest reports, we looked at results from some previous hunter surveys. In those surveys, hunters had indicated that the most important reason why hunters don't report is that they forget. So a few years ago, we decided to test that result by sending reminders to hunters in mid-January for DMAP hunters to report their harvest, and it appears that that has worked. DMAP reporting rates are now at or above 80%. And even with that 80% reporting rate, we still are not getting a complete count. So with incomplete counts provided by hunters, again, we have to rely on statistics. Complete counts require simple math, 1 + 1 + 1 up until the point that you've tallied all the responses. And if given the choice, everyone, including biologists, would prefer simple counts. Unfortunately, incomplete counts are a reality of wildlife management, and incomplete counts require statistics. As wildlife managers, we typically work with incomplete information. We do not see all the animals in a population because wildlife hide and are not seen. We do not get complete reporting of the harvest because hunters are not perfect and they forget to send in harvest reports, they forget to return surveys, and sometimes they just decide they do not want to provide that information to us. Statistics allows wildlife managers to estimate what is not seen or reported. In other words, we can take partial counts, combine it with additional data, and estimate the total. And deer harvests are a good example of using statistics to estimate the total with incomplete counts and additional data collected in the field. Deer harvest estimates are based on counts of deer checked in the field and hunter reports. We are fortunate that we do not need to make guesses about any of the data we use when estimating deer harvest. First, Game Commission biologists, foresters, and others who are trained to age deer check deer at processors. In this example, our deer agers checked 100 deer at the processors. Next, hunters are required to report their harvest, and 50 hunters reported the deer that we checked at the processors. From this sample, we calculate that each harvest report equals 2 deer, because hunters reported 50 of the 200 deer that we checked. Next, we look at the number of deer reported at the wildlife management unit level. In this example, hunters reported 1,000 deer within the unit. From our sample, we know that each of those reports represents 2 deer, and as a result, the harvest estimate is 2,000 animals. This is a general overview of how we estimate the harvest for antlered and antlerless deer in every unit each year. In this example, the blue numbers represent counts, the red numbers represent calculations. Because statistics do not provide complete counts, we double check our results by estimating the deer harvest from a hunter survey. Each year, 2% of hunters, or about 18,000 hunters, are randomly surveyed after the hunting season as part of the game take survey. These surveys ask hunters, what species did you hunt, where did you hunt, how often did you hunt, and how many did you harvest. This survey follows standard survey protocols, and the results from this sample of hunters, those that we have sent the survey to, are then expanded to all hunters to estimate total harvest. The next question is, how well do these two methods work? Based on available data, our procedures work well. We cannot judge our estimates against the true harvest because that is unknown. However, when we have 2 harvest estimates giving similar results, it increases our confidence in the estimates. This graph shows the agreement between our estimates based on the reporting rates in blue and those from the game take survey in red. Over the last decade, the 2 different methods of estimating the deer harvest track each other closely. This consistent and long-term agreement between 2 different methods increases our confidence in our harvest estimates. Despite this consistent agreement, demands for complete counts continue to be heard. For our reporting rate deer harvest estimates, a common complaint is every hunter should be required to report, regardless of harvest, so that there is a complete count of the harvest. For hunter surveys, a common complaint is, well, I didn't get a survey, so your results are not correct. Although talking about 2 different statistical methods, the sentiment in these statements is the same. We need to use complete counts that include every hunter's harvest in activity and opinion. On the surface, these may seem like reasonable requests. So why don't we require every hunter to report their harvest or require every hunter to complete a survey? Put simply, complete counts are expensive and not needed. First, let's look at requiring every hunter to report their deer harvest. If every hunter was required to report, regardless of harvest, it would cost the Game Commission about $850,000 a year. There are about 1.7 million tags, including general license antlered tags and the antlerless license tags, that need to be reported each year. These reports, even with our online system, cost the Game Commission about 50 cents each. As a result, if hunters reported every tag that was out there, the cost would be $850,000 a year. If we compare this to our current system, where successful hunters are required to report, the total cost is about $75,000 a year. Because of the amount of data collected by Game Commission deer aging personnel and the number of reports provided by hunters, our deer harvest estimates are very precise. In other words, there's not a lot of room to improve the estimates. Requiring every hunter to report every tag, regardless of harvest, would cost the Game Commission about $775,000 more each year, and most of that would be spent on reports of no harvest. From a statistical and practical perspective, we cannot justify increasing current costs by more than 10 times for little real benefit. Next, let's look at the surveys and why we don't need to survey every hunter. There are 2 aspects of surveys that impact the decision to send a survey to every hunter. and whether or not we should do that. First, like all estimates, survey results have variation or a plus or minus associated with them. As sample sizes increase, the estimates plus or minus get smaller. And you can see that in this graph. As you go to the right, the sample sizes are getting larger. The bars measuring the variation or the plus or minus in the estimates get smaller. This means this sample size it declines quickly from small sample sizes, say 10 to 100, but once you get out, say around 5,000, you can get all the way out to 35,000, and you're not increasing or improving the variation very much. The second consideration when deciding how many hunters to survey is cost. And as survey sample size increases, so does the cost. If we assume it costs about $1 for mailing and processing the data for each survey, surveying 5,000 hunters would cost $5,000. Surveying 35,000 hunters would cost $35,000. But remember, when we look at the results and the variation, they're very similar. Therefore, surveying $35,000 would essentially, 35,000 hunters would essentially be wasting $30,000 for our agency. Surveying a sample of hunters rather than trying to survey all hunters is effective. You get similar results and efficient. You spend less money. As long as resources are limited, sampling is a necessity in our work. Statistics are a requirement for reliable wildlife estimates. We cannot just count animals or harvest reports. Animals hide from us, hunters forget and do not report or return surveys. We need statistics to bridge that gap between what we can count, the number of animals seen, the number of harvest reports received, and what we cannot count. That would be the number of animals that we did not see or the number of harvest reports that we did not, that were not submitted. Without statistics, we cannot address these missing data. When done properly and with good sample sizes, statistics provide reliable results. For our deer harvest estimates, we have two methods giving us similar results year after year. And finally, sampling is more efficient than attempting to send surveys to every hunter or requiring every hunter to send in a harvest report. It simply makes more sense in terms of time and resources to sample rather than attempt to survey or get reports from everybody out there. With that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from any of the commissioners?
I have one.
Jim.
Chris, I think this is something that we've talked about. I know the survey kind of follows along the trend line, so that's a good thing. But, you know, we're using data from processors, and a lot of people process their own. And I gotta wonder if I got a survey and I never reported my harvest, would I put it on the survey thinking that someone's gonna catch the fact that I hadn't reported? Have we figured that out? I mean, are people less likely to report that they took a deer on a survey since they never reported it as they should have?
That's something we could potentially look at. The surveys do go out. They're typically going out at this time of year, a little later. I mean, the survey are running through April, I think. So there is that time lag between when a hunter may have sent a report card in or may not have in the survey. It's something we could look at. Just in what we've seen, I don't know that those two kind of things would be connected that clearly. But overall, when we look at it, the fact that we're looking at that many hunters with the reports as well as then with the survey, drawing from a different sample type of thing.
I just didn't know if it was a bias. I mean,
Yeah.
statistics, you gotta watch for bias.
Right, there potentially could be. Again, most of those harvest reports that we get, we'd have to look.
Thanks. Yeah.
Would a bigger impact be that if there's a change in hunter behavior as far as home processing? In other words, if you have year to year the same proportion, would that even it out?
Potentially. One of the things with that survey, given that that's a random sample of our hunters, that includes those that take it to a processor and those that don't, the fact that those two match up suggests to us that the reporting rates of folks that take it to a processor, despite what we might think, do not appear to be much different than those who process at home, because our random sample of both gives us a similar result. And so that's where it's always tough to speculate on hunter behavior and what they might or might not do, because one thing you would think, well, if you take it to a processor, you might be more likely to report. that doesn't seem to be true. Yes?
Chris, I'm 100% on board on how to obtain these numbers. I think it's very scientific. I agree with what you're doing. My concern, as we've talked about before, is the perception problem. Hunters, maybe not all of them, but most hunters, or a large majority of the hunters, just don't believe these numbers. Is there anything we can do, or that you believe that we can do as a board to get hunters to buy into this, these numbers? You know, the numbers came out, and of course everybody's, this is ridiculous. How could they be up when, we don't see any deer?
Right.
It just, I would love to solve that perception problem if it's solvable. And I know we've talked about it, but
Yeah.
it just really rubs me the wrong way
Right.
that.
Yeah, it's, okay, I guess there's the question about being an optimist or being practical here. From a practical standpoint, I think folks are always going to, I think it's an issue of scale. We're providing our estimates at the unit level. When folks are hunting, they're typically hunting at whatever scale that is. Hundreds of acres, a couple thousand. They talk to a few other guys, and the scale might get a little larger, but you're still talking generally acres of hunting versus 1,000, 2,000 square miles at the unit level. So I think there's always going to be that disconnect between, well, this is what I saw, and this is what the Game Commission reported as a harvest for that wildlife unit where I was. And even that, I think there's a lot of assumptions there that, that we as, when you're hunting, make versus what we're doing as, as a deer biologist making recommendations or estimating harvest at the unit level. I think just constantly putting it out there, what we do, that we're looking to make sure that our estimates are good, that they're reliable over time. That may be the best we can do. I don't know that we're ever going to eliminate that skepticism. And I mean, we all share it ourselves when it's other entities providing information. We all have some of that skepticism, and they could tell us all the details, and you still might wonder whether or not they're correct and true. But I think in our case, specific to our work, we can only be upfront, transparent in our work that we do, provide that information, and go from there. This year it was interesting with the harvest. One of the things that did go up considerably was the number of harvest reports. I think we had 150,000 reports this year. Last year it was only 100 and might have been like 125 or something. So yes, the Game Commission estimated a greater harvest, but hunters also reported harvesting more animals. So it's not just us saying that the harvest went up. What hunters sent into us went up as well. I don't know, that may be something you can try, if you're out at a sportsman's group or something like that and somebody argues, and see how that works. But that's really the best we can do. At the end of the day, we're still estimating. There's still plus or minus associated with it. And we just, as people, we just don't like that. We'd much rather have a count. And I would agree with that. I would
It's
much
funny
rather have
because
a count as well.
after Brian did his annual report to the Senate, of course I was on YouTube watching, and I went back to when I think Carl was still the executive director, and you were being grilled by the House at that point. And you kept telling them, and I mean, I don't know how you say it politely, but it just doesn't matter.
Right.
That difference between what we estimate and what the actual number is doesn't matter. And it's hard, I think that's hard for hunters to understand, that just doesn't matter portion.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's so,
Right.
I mean, in the big scale, it doesn't
Right.
matter.
Right.
I think a one-time count would be a good thing, and have the count show that, we're doing, our numbers are accurate, so they could silence these people, because it's just painful,
I think the last time we did that was around 1938. There's a Game News article about that, but yeah, we could go back to that old issue somewhere and find it, and we could try it.
Any other questions for?
Just one.
Yeah.
So you said the report cards were up. Was the reporting rate up too, Chris, or not?
It was about the same,
Okay.
still in the low 30%.
And it still varies a lot by WMU to WMU, doesn't
It
it?
still does, yes.
So what's the, like, the high and the low, and why are they so different, do we know?
I think depending on, I forget antlered, but you're looking at a low in the 20s and a high in the 40s.
A lot of difference.
So, yeah, I'm not going to speculate to the character of the hunters from those different units that, we just see it.
Is it-
And that's why we do it unit by unit.
Is it an age-related issue? Are we seeing a difference in the seasons where you would see more, I guess, younger adults out during the archery season, for instance?
Game take, we do see a difference in age in terms of responses to game take survey, where your seniors tend to be, if I recall correctly, they tend to be your higher reporters in terms of returning the survey part. I'm sure if we looked at it, we could probably find that variation in just about any aspect of it. Whether it would have an effect or not, I mean, it's something we could look at, because with the new licensing system, we could go back to all the deer we checked. We would be able to tell how old those hunters were and then look at reporting.
I think it'd
that
be
way.
interesting to find out. I mean, maybe we can focus down a little bit on the reporting method then, to determine what's causing the ones that don't report. Now, readily, when you're out there hunting and it may take a little time for you to get to a computer or get to your phone or whatever, or in a lot of cases, that report card still hurts us a lot.
Right. Yeah, this year, I think we were up over 60% online reporting. So that's encouraging for all the data
really
entry
good.
folks and everything else. But yeah, I think the interesting thing has been that result with DMAP, where DMAP reporting rates, they were dropping and they were down in the 40s. So they were getting close to where we are normally. And I suspect if we'd have just left it go, we might be in that range again. But because it's a smaller group of people, we're talking 20-some thousand permits versus 900,000. We have sent postcard reminders, and just that little reminder showing up in mid-January has allowed them to really bump that up. And I mean, that's one of the things with one of our recommendations. If we were to try and address the reporting rate, it would not be to shorten that time period. It would be, let's go with a date similar to DMAP, early February, where we could focus our attention in terms of reminding hunters in general, not sending out necessarily postcards to 900,000 people, but and communications effort, that sort of thing, to remind them it's time to report. We might see a bump, but even so, at 80%, there's still 20% that's unknown. So we'll never have a complete count.
You comfortable with the archery harvest estimates? Because I know that you're not aging deer during the archery
Right,
season,
and we've looked at that as well with game take again. In the harvest by seasons tend to match up fairly closely as well. In the past, we did go out, 2000, 2001, we went out after the weekend of the October rifle. And what we found was, unfortunately, we put a lot of miles on vehicles and took a lot of time, and we got very few deer. It's just not a good time of year to get a good sample. And we did see a little bit of a difference there where archers were reporting at a higher rate, but it doesn't have that big of an impact on the harvest estimates. And again, when it comes to, if we take these harvest estimates and put them into our program, what effect do they have on what we do? They feed into the population estimates. And from there, we're looking at trends. So it's not like, well, this is biased 10% high, so we're estimating the population is 10% high, and therefore we're going to put out 10% too many allocations. No, it's not off of a set number. We're just looking at how that trend is going over time. So some of this noise, which we're going to have at a statewide scale with partial reporting, it's not as a direct effect on what we're recommending as it would be if we were going off of a set number compared to another number type of thing. So there's some aspects of the deer program that we've tried to account for that variability that we just have to deal with.
When we go out during the rifle season and we age, are most butchers keeping a book or a log of all the deer that they're handling?
I'm sure they are for processing and money and cost and what folks want. Typically, we're working out of the back of the shop where all the barrels are, so.
We're not even looking at the actual numbers that the butchers are handling?
No.
Would that be an added influence on the numbers?
I don't think so, because they're not recording license numbers or anything like that. They're recording a guy's name and address, type of thing. And a lot of times anymore, I mean, in the area where I'm at, if you want to take your deer to the processor, you're going to pay an extra $20 for them to skin it. So many guys now, they're taking meat, or the deer's already skinned, sort of thing. So they might say, yeah, we processed 200 deer, but they might have only received 100 intact animals whose heads show up in the barrel out back. So I think that potentially might complicate things more. What we have now is fairly straightforward, seems to work. So I don't know that I would necessarily want to mess around and add another unknown to what we're doing.
Who actually is handling the heads in the back out of the barrels? I mean, you are.
Deer biologists, or biologists, foresters, and then there are other people in the agency, including
So it's
ones-
all people that we employ then?
Yeah, they're all game commission
It's
employees.
got to be a fun job, huh?
People do it. Not necessarily. They do it begrudgingly sometimes. But some actually volunteer for it within the agency. But yeah, they are deer agers. They have to go through training every 3 years so that we know that they are accurate in what they're doing. But yeah, it's not necessarily the greatest warm and fuzzy wildlife moments at the back of a process.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's just take a minute and congratulate the members of the deer team, because the Game Commission submitted the deer management plan to a group of scientists across North America, Canada, and the United States. And you could probably add a little bit to this, because I'm just getting, but the deer management plan was rated #1 among 667 plans that were submitted, tied with 3 others. I think Montana's pronghorn sheep, maybe, and
Yeah, Montana, Washington, and then Wisconsin's deer.
so. Can you expand just a little bit on that?
It was a survey we didn't know about. They took on the survey to try and get at what is the scientific basis of wildlife management in North America. And what they did was they surveyed plans from across the country and Canada. And basically they came up with 11 criteria that they judged whether or not the plans met those criteria. And our deer program scored as high as any plan in the country. So I think a lot of it, I have talked to that author. I spoke to him the other day on the phone, the lead author, about this, the whole issue. And I told him, I said, one of the things that we have in the Game Commission that we don't see in a lot of our other states, they would like to have what we have, but as an agency, that level of support may not be there. I mean, what we can do in the Game Commission with even the deer aging, that commitment of all those folks from across those different jobs for those number of days during the hunting season provides us with a data set that a lot of other states simply don't have. But those are decisions over the years that have been made and supported within our agencies. So one of the benefits in our deer program is we can put things in our deer program, and then we can actually collect data to assess and judge those measures. Whereas other states, yes, they would like to do that, but they don't have the resources to evaluate or to monitor those particular objectives. So I think that's one of the benefits, and I think it showed in that survey, is that we have within the deer program here in the Game Commission has a lot of support, and it has over the years to develop into what it is today. So it's not just 3 people or my program. The agency's support of the whole program and the folks that contribute to it is what puts it where it is, and makes it so that we can write a plan, put all those components in it, and then actually keep track of them.
One of the variables, I just need to say this, is one of the variables that they looked at was transparency.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that goes a long way with all the naysayers that we have about the deer program. So congratulations to you and everyone in the agency that made that happen. That's an outstanding honor for us to have.
Yeah.
So thanks. All right, I guess we're ready to move on. You want ready to talk about DMAP?
Sure. Load that up. Okay. So DMAP, the Deer Management Assistance Program. The Deer Management Assistance Program, or DMAP, provides hunters with property-specific deer management options. The Game Commission manages statewide deer populations at the Wildlife Management Unit level, and on average, these are 2,000 square miles. Within each of those wildlife management units, individual landowners may have different management objectives or experience different levels of deer impacts than what is observed at the unit level. It is for this reason that DMAP was designed to give individual landowners the opportunity to manage deer on their properties according to their individual management goals. DMAP provides additional antlerless deer hunting opportunities within the regular deer seasons. DMAP is available to both public and private landowners. Standard permit rates vary from 1 permit per 5 acres of agriculture to 1 permit per 50 acres. If landowners need more permits, they can request more than the standard permit rate by completing a management plan. For private landowners, this involves responding to 5 questions or requests for information on 1 page of the application. So it's not necessarily overly burdensome for private landowners. DMAP permits can be used to take antlerless deer in all seasons, including all 12 days of the regular firearm season. And finally, any public land DMAP applications require a deer management plan. The public land management plan is more involved than what's expected or requested from private landowners. DMAP applications are available online. The instructions and application can be found on the Game Commission's homepage under Quick Clicks. The applications are submitted to one of 6 Game Commission region offices and must be postmarked by May 1st. In most cases, the Game Commission will mail coupons to the applicant or landowner. The landowner then distributes the coupons to hunters of their choosing. The hunters must then take the coupon to a licensed issuing agent to purchase a permit. And hunters are limited to 2 permits per DMAP area. Permit costs $10.90 for residents, $35.90 for non-residents. DCNR, in particular Bureau of Forestry, is the largest landowner in Pennsylvania. It's also the largest user of DMAP. DCNR uses DMAP to achieve specific goals. DCNR's goals for DMAP are to promote healthy habitat for wildlife and deer, provide hunting opportunities, support sustainable forests with minimal need for deer fencing, and to promote healthy and sustainable forest communities. As a public landowner, DCNR is required to submit deer management plans with their DMAP applications. These applications are based on data collected from thousands of plots across the state forest. Data collected include a variety of measures of forest regeneration, wild plant presence or absence, forest conditions, deer browsing and impacts on regeneration, current and future management activities, and the use of DMAP and hunter success rates. Across the state, DMAP represents a small part of our statewide deer harvest. Since 2003, DMAP deer harvests have ranged from 4,000 to 8,000. In this graph, the small blue bars represent the DMAP harvest. Statewide antlerless harvest, represented by the large red bars, have ranged from about 180,000 to over 300,000. So across the state, minimal impact of DMAP on our overall harvest. However, DMAP harvest does vary by wildlife management unit. For most units, DMAP represents less than 6% additional antlerless harvest. However, there are 3 units where DMAP represents more of an antlerless harvest. 2F, in 2016, DMAP represented 14% additional antlerless deer being taken. In units 2G and 2H, DMAP represented 22 and 28% additional antlerless harvest in those units. And if you recall back, that's also where we have a lot of the DCNR public land. However, when we look at data from marked deer, it indicates that harvest rates on public DMAP properties tend to be low. From our field work, particularly in Wildlife Management Unit 2G, where DMAP adds the most to the antlerless harvest, we see some of the lowest harvest rates. This graph shows data from a study we completed in from 2008 to 2011 in 4 wildlife management units. And within those 4 units, 2G had the most public land as well as the most DMAP. And you can see the lowest antlered and antlerless harvest rates in 2G as a whole. So that's at the unit level. If we look at the property-specific level, we can look at our current study on DCNR public lands and state forests where DMAP is being used to look at harvest rates and other factors affecting forest and deer management on these properties. This graph shows the difference in harvest rates of antlered deer, the blue bars, and antlerless deer, the red bars, on the different study sites during the first 2 years of our current study. One site within each of our study areas has a higher DMAP allocation than the standard permits of 1 per 50. The other site has the standard 1 per 50 acres, 1 permit per 50 acres. And that one is on the right side under standard, and then on the left is the higher DMAP allocations. On this graph, we can see 2 results of interest. First, antlered harvest rates are very low. The blue bars should be in the 0.3 to 0.6 range when compared to other parts of the state. In this graph, they're less than 0.2 on these public lands in central and north central Pennsylvania. And secondly, antlerless harvest rates are low, 10% or less, even with the higher DMAP permit allocations. Based on these results of individually marked deer in the field, the evidence suggests DMAP does not result in excessive antlerless harvest on public lands. These results from previous studies have led us to questions that we seek to answer as part of our ongoing study, including will higher DMAP permit allocations increase these harvest rates, and to what extent? And what effect do those harvest rates have on deer populations in heavily forested environments? But right now, we are not seeing high harvest rates, even with higher than the standard DMAP permit allocations. In conclusion, DMAP provides landowners with deer management options. Landowners can use DMAP according to their individual goals. DMAP adds little to the overall harvest, but may increase the harvest on particular properties depending on how it's used by the landowner and the hunters. DMAP applications and instructions are available on the Game Commission's website, and DMAP applications must be submitted to one of our 6 region offices and be postmarked by May 1st. Again, be glad to answer any questions.
I have one.
Yes.
So looking at these harvest rates, and you're looking at what, about 10%, I think it was, on the antlerless, and statewide, what are we, about 1 in 4?
No, harvest rates for statewide were probably in the upper teens, around 20%.
So these double.
Yeah, so these are about half.
So is that telling us that they're asking for DMAP where there really aren't that many deer? It seems like, you know, because I've seen these applications sometimes, there are places where the density is really low. You know, it could be 8 deer per square mile, it could be 10 deer per square mile, and they're still asking for DMAP.
You know, it's interesting because we're trapping in some of these areas, or all these areas that, you know, that we're showing these results from. You know, and this year, and we see that difference between these different locations. 2G, our study area up there, you know, this year that crew is leading the deer capture numbers. There are over 100 animals they've captured already this year. So there's a large number of, there's a good number of animals there that they're able to capture that many. And yet those harvest rates are still low. And I think potentially what's telling there is even on the buck side. Those buck harvest rates are extremely low compared to what we see statewide. So it could be a combination of deer numbers lower than, lower deer numbers, And when it comes to hunting and deer numbers, some of the work that's been done other places, and even in controlled circumstances where they're trying to do targeted shoots with bait at night, suppressors, everything, everything that's not hunting, you still see a similar pattern where when deer numbers get to a certain point, the amount of effort that it takes to harvest one of those animals increases substantially. It's not a straight line relationship. So if deer numbers in some of these state forests are around that point, it's taking a lot more time for a hunter to kill a deer. Those numbers, and when you look at some of those curves, they still may be at a point where those animals are impacting the forest, especially some of these habitats that over the years have been hammered type of thing, and there's not a lot growing there. It's not going to take a lot of deer to keep that forest in that condition. So you have some of that going on. But I think it's probably, like most of this, a combination of deer numbers, hunter effort, the number of hunters that are going to those areas, because we see that difference. I mean, we see deer hunting in Pennsylvania has changed considerably. This year's, over the recent years, we've seen more and more of the hunters focusing on archery season. The rifle season's not the only game in town the way it used to be 20, 30 years ago. I mean, if you deer hunted, you went out during rifle season. Today, if you deer hunt, half of our hunters are buying archery stamps, and a decent percentage of them are now successful. So I think it's probably a combination. These are difficult places to hunt because it's just all forest. You don't have those edges where you can focus your attention. It takes some more time. In terms of access and things like that. I mean, the bald eagle, some of those places, there's a reason why deer survive. Most hunters are probably not going to go in there, and the only reason we go in there is because we have a random point that ended up being placed there. Otherwise, we wouldn't make that hike either. But the deer do, and things like that. So I think it's a combination of a number of things. But a lot of times what we're seeing with these harvest rates and with DMAP is a lot of them are being used. When those animals are being harvested on these DMAP properties, they are being harvested with the DMAP permits. So there is value still in those DMAP permits.
So the question, I guess, is that, we have, about 20,000 total tags, DMAP tags?
Something like that.
Around the state, so that number is a very small percentage. How is it concentrated specifically in those 3 units that it's so high, 28% in 2G, 22% 2H?
Right. I think a lot of that is, when you look at the land ownership up there, you have these large public land areas. In 2F, that would take in some of the KQDC, tens of thousands of acres under a consistent management approach. And then as well as the timber companies and things like that have some large land holdings up there. And I think if you look back in some of the antlers allocations, some of that has been discussed in terms of these are the allocations across a unit, but we encourage folks to use DMAP. And I think they're taking advantage of it. They're using it, and it's much more intensive management up there. They have specific goals, whether it's a large private landowner or the KQDC type group or ANF or DCNR. They have specific objectives they're trying to meet that may not just be about deer hunting. They're habitat based, things like that. So I think it's just a combination of that area has the large landowners. They have goals where DMAP can be helpful to them, and that they use our program.
So the question that came up, I had an opportunity to go see a group of farmers up in Armstrong County. Why we're only allowed to issue 2 DMAP permits per hunter? And here's the reason for their question, is that they're hunting on their private property. They've got equipment out, they've got buildings out, they've got sometimes livestock out. There's only a certain number of people that they want on their farm. Now, you're aware of Armstrong County and the deer numbers that are up there. And it's huge. They've got a lot of deer. What was the logic behind 2 per hunter?
The logic behind
It's probably a good logical explanation.
As far as I understand it, when that was put into the regulations, the idea was to basically maximize the number of hunters that could participate in this program. So if you had a landowner and they got 10 tags and they didn't have that limit, they could say one guy's going to use them. May not use them, but they could only give to one guy. Versus if you had this limit of 2, in order to get their permits out, they would have to have given it to 5. So that was why that was put into regulation, as far as, from what I recall, and the parts that I was engaged with on that. That was a decision that was made to, increase the amount of hunter opportunity with the DMAP program.
Were you around during green tag?
I don't know that I was here, but I think I tried to use it once.
Do you know how it works, or how it worked?
That was with the farmers, agriculture, they could have extra seasons
Where are all the
later.
people in the agency that are long in the tooth that know?
Yeah, that,
It was a special season with the traditional doe license. When the doe licenses first had the tag attached, it was an extra season specific to those farms, so you could use that license. It was, if I recall right, it was after Christmas, you
Yes.
used right on those farms. So it was
So,
unheard of prior.
it's like a DMAP without the extra, okay.
yeah, but the
Okay.
big thing there was you could use rifle after Christmas on those
Oh, okay,
properties.
all right.
So I guess I'm having a problem trying to figure out the lower number of bucks being taken when our DMAP tags are up and we're harvesting more does. Why is that impacting, because we're not taking bucks with a DMAP tag, why is that impacting the harvest of bucks?
I think that those buck harvest rates give you an indication of the kind of success hunters in general have in that area. The fact that we have mature bucks on those properties that we're tracking multiple years, I think it gives you some indication of either how difficult the hunting is, or how it gets hunted, or how the deer behave in those areas, and that they have areas that they can get into that hunters just aren't going to go into. And that's consistent. I mean, years ago, we pulled teeth on 5,000 or so adult bucks across the state. The oldest buck that we found was 10 and a half years old, was killed on the Cohana Wild area. I mean, he was public land deer probably for most of his life, especially in that area. It wasn't like he was on some small game lands. He was on a big public land area, and that was the oldest buck we saw all across Pennsylvania. So, and we've seen that consistently, that on these public lands, especially in 2G, you think about it, some of the roughest terrain we have in the state, least amount of access in terms of being able to drive around it and get to it closely, get close to a hunting spot. We see low harvest rates on bucks and does. So I think when you see those low harvest rates on those two particular study areas, the Susquehannock and Rothrock and Bald Eagle, which were represented up there with our current project, I think that's an indication of just what the hunting is like and how much pressure the hunters are putting on those deer. There's a lot of areas that the hunters can't get to or aren't getting to, but the deer find them.
So we're finding is, it may not be the fact that there aren't as many deer, but there's less hunters? Is that true?
I suspect it's a combination.
DCNR's management plans, they're all reviewed at the region level,
Correct.
right, at this point. So we're not disputing the plans that they're laying out to get their DMAP permits.
No, and they've done things similar to us. They have a decision chart that they go through, a defined process that their district forests need to use. Those things they're then reviewed down in there, from their folks in Harrisburg to ensure that it's consistent across the districts as best it can, and then they're submitted to our folks. So yeah, I'm not aware of too many of them in terms of the management plans and the data that they're providing where that's been an issue.
Are you seeing a lot of fluctuation in what they're asking for as far as DMAP?
I mean, they do have a process where they will enroll a property. They like to get it in for a minimum of 3 to 5 years and then reevaluate. So there are properties that come in, there are properties that go out on a regular basis, and that's driven by what they're seeing in the field, what their data are showing them. So no, it's not just it's in forever. They're evaluating at regular intervals.
Any other questions? DMAP? Great. Are you up again? No.
Done.
Small game now.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Matthew Snoop.
They gave me
First
small
time in
game.
front of the commission. We are brutal, you know that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They figured they'd put me right after deer talking about doves and not be near as controversial. So
Oh, I don't know. We'll have to see what Commissioner Daly has to say about that.
we'll see how this goes.
Everyone has a handout. There's a briefing paper here. one of the briefing papers that were, well, that's your fault that you don't have yours. They were up there. Oh, I took
Give
yours.
me all
Give me
all
it.
my-
Give me all my back. Yeah, this is all yours. Okay, put your stuff on my side.
Well, good morning, guys. I'm excited to be here talking about dove fields. It's a passion of mine, and so I'm happy to talk about it today. So small game hunting really is commonly what got us hooked. Hunting small game typically requires a lot less equipment, a lot less time, and it's really enjoyable for children, young adults, people just getting in, and even older adults as well. So these characteristics really make it fun across the board. But one of the interesting points is that if you ask a common hunter how prolific dove hunting is across the nation, they'd probably be pretty surprised to hear how common it is. And so when you look at national statistics for dove trends, there's 1.3 million dove hunters nationwide. Now compare that to the 1.5 million pheasant hunters nationwide, and that really gives you a perspective of how many dove hunters we have across the nation. So interestingly, dove is the #2 migratory game bird in the nation. And so when you tell a lot of people that dove hunting really follows fairly closely with the number of duck hunters out there, that's a fairly interesting statistic. And so it shows that dove hunting is commonly used across the nation. Why? Well, you know, as I said before, dove are often abundant. They're easy to clean after you harvest them, and they're delicious to eat. And dove hunting requires no special equipment, and often the hunting season is during the ideal time of year, right? It's not ice cold outside. And it's so that in and of itself makes it fun for young hunters, older adult hunters, and hunters our age. But in addition to that, it's fun for people with low mobility, and so it's one of those hunts that doesn't require much effort. And so really what a lot of the states have done is foster dove hunting in efforts to deepen its role in that hunting culture. So Pennsylvania, unfortunately, is on the opposite of this trend. So the number of Pennsylvania hunters since 2007 that hunt dove have dropped about 50%. So on average, approximately 3% of the Pennsylvania hunters participate in dove hunting. And so when you base this on the national average and compare this with the way Pennsylvania hunters are using dove hunting versus the national average, there is substantial untapped potential for increasing dove hunting participation in Pennsylvania. And so one of the things that we did in 2014 is we used the Pennsylvania Dove Hunter Survey to basically determine who is hunting doves, what is that age bracket, and then identify reasons for poor participation, right? That 3%, why is it 3%? Why isn't it more? Why isn't it as high as the national average? And then the other purpose was for other dove hunting related issues, seasons, and so on. But so one of the things I want to cover from this Pennsylvania Dove Hunting Survey was who is hunting doves. And so this is the age distribution. There in blue is the dove hunters, and there in, I guess you could call that yellow, is the number of pheasant hunters. And so you can see it has a pretty normal distribution there, as you would expect. But one thing I want to call your attention to is this age bracket right here, this 21 to 35-year-old age class, right? That's basically my age class, where you have young kids and you're doing things that you need to do that don't require a whole lot of time. And so this is also a really important age bracket for moving younger hunters into the older hunter age bracket. And so I think that's an important notation, is that age bracket is hunting doves more than pheasants. So one of the other things that we found from this dove hunting survey is that people aren't willing to drive, or they're not going to drive very far from their home. And so about 60% of the dove hunters out there could drive to a dove hunting spot in less than a half hour. And so about 80 to 90%, anywhere from a half hour to an hour. And so that's pretty common trend, right? You're going out to hunt doves in the afternoon. You don't want to drive 2 hours to go dove hunting. That's the whole purpose of dove hunting. It doesn't require a lot of time and effort. And so some of the other factors for poor participation that we found from this was that basically folks want more doves to hunt, and they want more places to hunt doves. So one of the other things that the other two things we really don't have control over, more personal free time, but we also, it was noted that they wish they could hunt doves on Sunday. And so the two primary reasons for that could increase participation was more doves to hunt and more places to hunt these doves. And so what other states have done is basically use the application of managed dove fields. And what this does is this allows agencies and private individuals to allow more areas to hunt and increase the number of doves in those areas. Now, when I talk about managed dove fields, I want to define that in the next slide, but I want to use this picture as an example that managed dove fields is not a pile of corn or pile of milo. It's really increased habitat. And so you can see on that left-hand side, there's a couple different variables there. Roost trees, burned wheat, which is there for food. The roost trees there for obviously roosting, water. And all those intricate dynamics have to play a role in what exactly is provided as a managed dove field. And so let me better define what a managed dove field is. So it's an agriculture field with various habitat features that are selected. And so they're selected in roost trees, they're selected for water, so on and so forth. So it's not just one variable like food. So that agriculture field is planted with a grain, and then when that grain matures, it's manipulated to put that grain on the surface of the ground, because doves are ground feeders. They're not scratchers like a dove or like a quail would be. And so obviously the intent of this is to draw doves in the field for the purpose of hunting. And so some of the benefits of a managed dove field in PA are, first and foremost, they provide more doves to hunt, and they're more consistent places to hunt doves. And so these consistent places to hunt doves, in addition to that, they're often closer to the hunters. And so it does suffice to meet that half-hour drive in a lot of cases. But also the benefit is that it could increase engagement of those 21 to 35-year-old hunters. And so some of the concerns of a managed dove field in Pennsylvania is that obviously it changes the agency's position on managed dove field. And so this could have some unintended consequences that should be considered. It could also violate a violation of the Fair Chase Code, and ultimately it can undermine decisions in other species and affect law enforcement. And so generally speaking, those are some of the primary concerns that could be had when applying managed dove fields in PA. And so in summary here, dove hunting is fun and easy and extremely popular across the nation. There is, according to our 2014 dove survey, there's potential for increasing dove hunting participation in Pennsylvania with those key variables. Pennsylvania dove hunters want more doves to hunt and more places to dove hunt that are close to home. So managed dove fields have been recommended as a method to increase hunter satisfaction based on those variables. But ultimately, the benefits and concerns of these managed dove fields should be considered. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions in conjunction with the Law Enforcement Bureau.
So the concerns, you had three concerns: law enforcement, fair chase, and baiting issues, right? Were those the three?
Yes, sir. Those are in your the packets that were handed out.
Are they legitimate concerns? What are we looking at? Because I think when we talked about the baiting issue, the concern was, is the food source going to be on the ground during archery season when hunters come in? Is it going to be a violation? Are we looking at something that is going to be there when archery season opens up, or
Early goose season too.
early goose season?
So the specifics of those concerns, I would pass off to law enforcement. I think they're going to have a better idea of what exactly those are. But my point would be that there's always going to be unintended consequences, and they should be evaluated. And I think that that's where these concerns come from, is the unintended consequences of doing this. Now, those should be evaluated against the benefits of doing this as well. But the specifics of that, I think that I could hand that off to the Law Enforcement Bureau to better define what exactly those unintended consequences may be.
Here's Randy here. Come on down.
Come on down, you're the next contestant.
I think I spelled it out as best I could in the position paper. But my concern from an enforcement standpoint is under section 2308A8 of the Game and Wildlife Code, which is statutory law, it spells out that the use of grains, hay, chemicals, salt, mineral as an attractant for hunting game or wildlife is a violation of statutory law. There are several exceptions to that. Normal and accepted agricultural practices is an exception. Another exception would be an accepted habitat management practice. Now, our Bureau's interpretation of those exceptions historically in recent times has been, if you have a food plot and it's planted and it's growing, that is an acceptable habitat management practice. Our interpretation beyond that has been, if that food plot is manipulated in any way, shape, or form, that would be a violation under state law of baiting. Now, taking that into account, if we allow a managed dove fields and the manipulation of a food plot for managed dove fields, my concern is that this could potentially cross over into other species, because the exception under 2308A8 for an accepted habitat management practice is not species specific or species dependent. So while our interpretation has been that manipulation now crosses the line to a baiting violation, so the concern is, if we allow it for doves, even if we try to mitigate these concerns by putting time frames for the manipulation and limiting it to species, my concern from an enforcement standpoint is that legal interpretation, court cases down the road could potentially determine that this cannot be limited by species, and that therefore people would be able to do this same type of manipulation activity for other species across the board, including big game species. That's my concern from an enforcement standpoint. The Bureau doesn't stand opposed to the concept of managed dove fields. The Bureau stands opposed to the potential ramifications down the road impacting other species. U.S. Fish and Wildlife regulations allow the concept of managed dove fields. It's completely legal and legitimate. They also prohibit it for waterfowl hunting. So therein lies my concern, and I think I spelled it out. I tried to articulate it as best as I could in the position paper. So just looking down the road, are we going to have potential impacts that are going to cross over into other species? And if we do, can we put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak? That's
So
my concern.
this is being done across the country, right? This is kind of a standard practice across the country.
It is.
Did you reach out to anyone who's already doing managed dove fields and kind of find out what their law enforcement issues have been?
Well, yes, I did. I spoke to Ohio. Ohio has a tremendous amount of managed dove fields, and what it comes down to is the specific language in their state wildlife code is what it comes down to. We have that specific narrow language that would basically, in order for us to make this a lawful activity, we have to define under our code manipulation as lawful, which could impact other species. Every state's wildlife laws are completely different,
Right.
and they have different authorities. So they did not have any issues implementing this under the language of their state law.
Okay.
So what's the impact? I mean, I don't see the impact. So we currently, you're up in a tree stand, somebody's harvesting corn, there's corn being thrown all over the field, you're hunting over it anyway. It's the same fact. You're still ending up with corn on the ground, you're still ending up with sorghum on whatever on the ground, and we're not talking about that issue. We're only talking about the fact that we're doing it specific for doves.
Correct, and the harvesting of the corn, et cetera, that would fall under one of those exceptions as a normal agricultural practice. So if a farmer harvests a cornfield and he has a bunch in a wagon and he's going down the road, he makes a turn at the edge of the field and spills out on the ground, he's not baiting wildlife. That's part of a normal agricultural practice. But to have a standing field that you plant specifically for doves and dove hunting, and then to manipulate that to make it more attractive for the birds that come in, because that's how they feed on the ground, as Matthew stated, That, again, this is an agency interpretation of our existing state law. It would be that would be a violation of baiting.
So I reached out to former Commissioner Putnam and talked to him about this a little bit.
Yes.
And one of the things that he brought up, because he's old, so he's got he knows a lot of these things. I hope you're watching. But I guess there was a time where they used to broadcast spread wheat across fields. And he knew what farmers did that, and they went out and sat by their farms because it was loaded with doves after they spread the wheat.
What was the purpose of spreading the wheat? I guess?
Cover crop. It was a cover crop, so it was a standard practice.
Right, so it fell under the exception
Yeah.
of a normal and accepted agricultural practice. Yeah.
But I mean, really, in my eyes, there's not a whole lot of difference between one and the other.
But you can't outlaw farming, Tim. You can't outlaw going and taking a crop that's growing, let's take the outer 3 or 4 rows, let's cut it all up and leave it lay there to attract critters. That's what you're doing here. That's different than the farmer doing his normal routine. We can't outlaw farming.
Yeah,
We could try.
we can You know, I've hunted Delaware and I've hunted Maryland over managed dove fields, and I will tell you that the excitement that it generates and the number of people that are involved is worth the change. And Pennsylvania is ideally the slowest state around to make changes. So, yeah, I get it. I think it's a good thing if we want to try to increase participation in a specific sport, get younger people into the sport again, try to get some activity going. I think it's a great idea. And I'm willing to take the chance of someone hunting over it for deer. And what's it gonna, I mean, we're not talking about covering the whole state of Pennsylvania in managed fields. We're talking about a very small portion in small areas, so I don't think it's a big impact.
And we're generally not talking corn as a crop
Right.
for managed dove fields. I mean,
No.
doves aren't eating
Be
corn,
sunflowers
right?
or
They're-
whatever.
Yeah, typically it's sunflower millet, because they
Right.
don't mature. Corn doesn't mature till October. It's
Yeah.
done with
Right.
by
Yeah.
that
It's a
time.
big kernel too.
Yeah.
I have a question on these managed dove fields. Are landowners who do this going to be able to, for example, charge hunters to come onto their property to hunt these managed fields? That,
It happens.
They do it all the time.
I mean, that's legal then. That'll be,
Yeah, there would be nothing to prohibit that.
Yeah. I mean, clubs spring up all over the place. They do it. I mean, that
I've
was-
already had phone
yeah.
calls about people wanting me to join their club because they're going to do a managed field if we pass this, and you know everyone will pitch in some money to help take care of the agricultural costs. So.
And it's not on the ground for a long period of time. I mean, when you get into this situation, you're seeing, I mean, it gets cleaned up pretty quickly, and typically it's early September, doesn't run through till the October timeframe, because by then the crop's already harvested and gone anyway, prior to the deer season opening up, and even the turkey season at that point. So, yeah, I'm not seeing the downside of it.
But under the proposed regulation, the last manipulation has to occur by September 15th.
right.
Right.
That's
And
correct.
statewide, our deer season typically opens up the first Saturday in October, the first closest Saturday. the first
Generally,
of October.
yes.
Yeah, so it's off the ground by the time it gets there anyway.
And typically, most of the grains used for dove are very small, which
Right.
deer are just not gonna waste the time trying to pick up that
Correct.
seed. It's too hard.
And as far as the resource goes, this isn't going to be an issue. I mean, we've got a
Biologically,
overabundance of
Right.
doves.
They've been on the increase
Right.
nationwide, according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
To contrast the numbers, you look at Pennsylvania, there's an estimate, correct me if I'm wrong, about 14,000 dove hunters in Pennsylvania, which has been a 50% reduction since 2007. You contrast to South Carolina and North Carolina, where you're talking between 38 and 50, about 50,000 dove hunters. It's a significant difference.
So even with the 14,000 numbers, and even if we said 30,000, there's not a significant increase in the potential for other animals to get involved in this.
Well, I
You're not
think-
talking a lot of space.
Well, I think what we're talking about is a significant opportunity for hunters.
Oh, I
to
agree with
new
you.
hunters, and
Yeah.
even your older hunters who can't, you know, it's hard for them to get
Right.
out and chase deer.
Sure.
And again, this goes toward our goal to increasing opportunities for small game hunting.
retention and
Right.
It's the
Uh,
environmentally option.
You know, traditionally, Randy, I haven't gone against wildlife protection, but this might be one of those times that,
Well, just
you don't
in-
get my support.
I understand, and like, again, there's no one in my bureau that's opposed to hunter recruitment and retention and, you know, creating additional opportunities, certainly. But like, in a nutshell, what it amounts to is, if the agency, if this board declares the manipulating of a standing crop or food plot to be a valid habitat management practice, the concern is the courts are going to view that as not being, it cannot be a species-specific determination. That's
During
my
that
concern.
period of time of manipulation, yes. But if you see somebody out there October 1st manipulating a field, that's another subject.
Correct, and therein lies the concern. If a large landowner plants a large cornfield and decides they want to cut it or manipulate it right before the rifle bear season starts, so to speak, we would interpret that as a violation of the baiting laws. That those individuals would get cited.
It'll still continue to be that way.
Correct. But it's the fallout from the courts that I'm concerned about.
I don't know how they extrapolate it to get to that point, though.
Yeah.
We're talking a period of time for 2 weeks, September 1st to the 15th. Now you're talking mid-October manipulating a field. There's a big difference in that. If a judge wants to go that jump, that's a big leap to make.
Right.
Matthew, in your report, you said that dove hunting was easy. Have you ever?
Not easy to
have
hit
you
'em.
ever been dove hunting?
Not easy to hit them,
I
just
can-
easy to go sit on a cooler and face yourself against the sun. That's all, that's the easy part.
Well,
Hitting
half
'em
the
is
fun
hard.
is just taking a shot.
That's right,
I mean,
that's right.
pheasant hunting, not that I
What's-
miss many pheasants, but when I miss them, it really doesn't matter, because I got the dog working and it's just all good.
What's the average in a box of shells?
Yeah, not good on
Not
me.
good.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, very good, Matthew, thank you.
Thank you.
We need a break. We good? We do. Let's take a 10-minute break. We're down the street? No, it's not. Oh, is that why you were asking him if he used boxes?